It's about time, but we finally got to the halfway point for Netflix's Avatar adaptation. And I just gotta say that even though those first 2 episodes were pretty rough, this show has steadily been improving with every new installment. But don't you worry, because there is plenty to talk about in this episode still, since it not only recreates the fan-favorite Bumi and Aang duel, but also several other beloved scenes from the original cartoon. And this episode's already taken me way too long to put out there, so without any further delay, let's bow in and see if this Bumi is just as rock solid as the original. Last time may have been a rush of highs and lows, but this episode opens on a positive note with some back and forth between Aang and Iroh.
Cities are like people. They always have their dark sides.
Seems pretty dark on all the sides these days.
One of the things I always wanted more of from the original show was Iroh and Aang time, so it's cool to see some of that here, even if I'm not super invested in either of these 2 versions of the characters. But that's enough having fun. It's time to move on with the episode, where Zuko is somehow managing to not only grab this dude, but also do something with fire, yell while he does it, and nearly immediately swap into this guy's clothes without being noticed by any of the other guards. I know I mentioned in the last episode that you shouldn't focus too much on logic, or entertainment stuff will pretty much always fall apart, but it feels like the people behind this show are actively trying to make me eat my own words. And we have the first bit of evidence to the theory that this show is partially written by ChatGPT, or at least informed by interns who googled basic character traits.
Hey, Bumi. How's training going? I'm doing alright with my forms, but shaping is hard.
Quick, nameless intern, tell me what Bumi is famous for. Ah yes, his weird snorting laugh. That's all we need. No setup that he's eccentric or thinks outside the box.
You gotta open your brain to the possibilities.
Nor any setup beyond him being the one who made Aang's whistle. It's funny because one of the weaker parts of the original show to me was saving any mention of Bumi until they arrive at the city that he becomes king of. There was no setup for that character before Omashu, and they chose to repeat the exact same decision here. Just worse because these kids aren't experienced with acting. But we gotta keep the episode rolling, so Iroh is carted off to the pit while Aang goes to meet the king. And I hate this scene for 3 reasons. For one thing, Bumi is clearly eccentric and a little goofy here.
Lotus root, pine bark, dried jasmine, scalding hot water, steep for 2 minutes. Tea?
But he wasn't set up in the flashback as being like this when he easily could have been. No, trying to make a badger mole instead of a sky bison whistle doesn't mean you're eccentric or goofy. It just means you're bad at whatever you were supposed to be doing here. This choice is actually made worse by having Aang figure out who he is right away. Not because it goes against how they did it in the original, but because we're led to believe it was the rock skipping line and the laugh that made Aang realize who he was actually talking to.
And he's very, very good at rock skipping.
Bumi?
You know, I try not to suggest many changes in my videos, mainly because the material already exists, so it's too late now, but also because I'm just an idiot in the splits. However, we hear that Aang is good at skipping rocks, so why didn't we see that in the flashback sequence between Aang and Bumi? That would have been a great opportunity to show the 2 of them just hanging out and having fun doing something together, and also show Bumi's personality more. You know what, I'm just kind of ranting at this point because the truth is they actually did make all of these changes for a reason, and I'll address those when we get there. Besides, that's not even the main culprit behind why I dislike this part. This is.
Bumi! How are you still alive?
I hate that Bumi didn't make the guards let go of Aang. But more importantly, I hate that Aang didn't just break out of their grip so he could hug what may well be his only living friend in this age. Not only does it deny the audience of any sort of wholesome interaction between the 2, but you are throwing away the opportunity to have Bumi's reaction to the hug be informed by his, spoilers, anger towards Aang for disappearing. Thankfully, we get to cut to a little action exchange between Jet and Katara.
Jet.
You betrayed us.
What was the plan here, bro? Were you gonna kidnap her or something? Well, when he tries to grab her, she hits him with that Uno reverse and a Seonage free of charge. And I'm perfectly fine with this. Not only do I believe it's logical for Sokka to have taught this to her at some point, but it's also not performed the best due to the way they're positioned, selling her as more of an amateur. Yeah, it's still a little weird how often they're throwing melee combat into this show, but in this instance, there's enough character motivation for me to buy it and enjoy it. The only thing I'm not cool with is how the fight ends. She hits Jet with the same move we've seen her practicing for the last several episodes now, which again is authentic Tai Chi Chuan. But that's not the issue. This is. Yes, her freezing him is taken directly from the original cartoon, almost shot for shot, which is cool. But unlike that series where we've seen her freeze water many times by that point, this appears to be the first example of her turning water into ice. I'm willing to let it go, because it's still a good moment and a fun homage, and if you freeze frame on the scroll itself, there appears to be a technique that involves converting water into ice anyway, so it's set up, even if it's not cleanly set up. We know that waterbenders can do this because we know about it from the cartoon, but if they had shown her practicing this more, it would have been a little easier to accept for people not in the know. Regardless, after this altercation, we get a quick sequence involving Zuko deciding whether to pursue the Avatar or not be a piece of shit, followed by more compelling dialogue between Bumi and Aang.
You may be 100 years old, but you haven't lived for 100 years.
You know, you almost had a great line there. I just wish you stopped talking literally one sentence earlier.
Especially not these 100 years.
Who thought the especially line was necessary? Did you not think the audience understood which 100 years you were referring to? Man, how did a literal children's cartoon talk down to its audience less than the live-action adaptation that allows blood, swearing, and on-screen death? Well, it's time for the audience to turn on me even more. I never liked the Secret Tunnel episode, nor the hippies, nor the song. So even though it makes sense in the context of this episode, and compressing the Secret Tunnel episode into this one wasn't a bad idea, it's just not my cup of tea. I just never understood the appeal. Just like I don't understand why Sokka is the one getting into the song in this adaptation and not Katara. Does anybody else feel like this version of everybody's favorite waterbender is really boring? I'm only halfway through the season, and I just want to clarify that I think the actress is doing a fine job, but there is almost nothing to work with from this material. No matter how good you are at acting, if what you've got to say and do isn't cohesive, it's not really gonna do anything.
Twice the pride, double the fall.
Speaking of great acting, we finally get back to Iroh, where some life is breathed into this episode. And out of every moment in this adaptation, I think this scene does the absolute best of using all of the freedoms they have from censorship to its advantage.
There are many around these parts who'd be very interested to know that the famed Dragon of the West is in their midst. The Fire Nation general who laid siege to Ba Sing Se for 600 days.
I can 100% picture an Earth Kingdom soldier taking out his anger and sadness on one of the most infamous war generals of the opposing side. And in my opinion, it hits harder because it's in live action. This entire sequence is given the breathing room it needs to work, and it caps off with Iroh leaving a trail for Zuko to follow up on. It's genuinely great, and I didn't see enough people talking about this. Unfortunately, it's time to get back to Aang and Bumi. Yay, I guess. I'll give him credit though, this is definitely a different take on Amashu's king. You cannot say they are anywhere close to the same character. It's just a shame it sucks. Much like these hand movements from Aang. Needless to say, there's no martial arts being done here by either of the benders really. But at least the next two sequences are great. Zuko finds Iroh's breadcrumbs, and we finally get some good back and forth between the siblings. I actually like that the love theme in the tunnels is recontextualized as familial rather than romantic, although the story of Oma and Shu remains the same, so... Oops! But now we can finally talk about the best part of the episode. I still wish this guard had a better stance when he summoned the boulder, but at least it's a big-ass rock instead of that weak-ass pebble from the first episode. But obviously, this isn't what I mean when I say the best part. No, what I'm referring to is Lu Ten's memorial.
Brother, take comfort in knowing that Lu Ten will forever be hailed as a champion of the Fire Nation.
I love that not only do we get a bit more of a relationship between Ozai and Iroh, but more importantly, I adore how Zuko knows he f***ed up with his first attempt at consoling the dragon. Not only is Dallas's line delivery here fantastic, but dude, these two carried this moment. I actually feel something when I watch this scene, and it hits home perfectly by having Zuko take a seat next to his uncle in complete silence. This should have been the stuff they focused on in the live-action adaptation, and I'll elaborate more on it when I reach the end of the video because I still have to go over the action pieces. But before we can even get to that, we have more back and forth between Sokka and Katara.
You know, Sai told me I should be an engineer. That was my true calling.
You believe that?
I don't know. But it was nice to hear someone tell me I had something to offer the world.
We are 4 episodes into this show, and I think I love it when these characters talk about anything other than the main plot with Aang. This is pretty good, all things considered, and I don't know, man, I think my fellow Texan here does a pretty good job of capturing Sokka's goofiness and ego-driven personality. You know, when the writers let him have one.
Besides my superior fighting skills.
I'll tell you one thing, though. If this cutting back and forth is getting on your nerves, it's driving me absolutely crazy having to write and edit this. Because right after this quick little scene, we have to get back to Aang keeping up the tradition of telling the audience what the characters' personalities are.
This isn't who you are. The Bumi I know is a fun-loving, happy kid who loves to skip rocks and always thinks about his friends.
Very clever. It's all about games with you, isn't it, Avatar?
Talk about a leap in logic, right? Who cares if it doesn't make sense? We just have to have Bumi and Aang fight. So while a super old man starts stripping in front of a minor, we cut right back to Sokka and Katara in the Caves of Incest and are introduced to the badger moles of this adaptation. We're only here for 30 seconds, and then we have to cut away again. But at least we finally get to a real fight scene in this episode. Yeah, it's a little bit silly that Zuko landed with an explosion and didn't aim at any of the enemies, but I'm gonna let you know right now, this fight is fantastic. You know how I was talking about that fight between Aang and Zuko being the best one in the adaptation so far? Well, this beats the hell out of that one. For starters, Zuko's first 3 moves are all real martial arts movements. This underhand claw is not only visually reminiscent of a similar technique performed in the original cartoon, but hey! Thanks to pulling the camera back, we can see how strong his stance work is, and they even made sure to line up the visual effects correctly. Then this follow-up claw strike has a deep-ass bow stance and just looks beautiful. Sure, the stuntman misses his cue a little bit, but these 2 exchanges by themselves are a marked improvement. Then we cap off the first bout with a nice illusion twist. Notice how because the benders are using their abilities from a distance instead of fighting up close, the camera has to be pulled back to capture it all, giving us a much better visual clarity for the action. I still don't like these rapid cuts on the illusion kick though, and that's still a recurring issue, but at least it's an editing one and not from a choreography or filming standpoint. The second bout begins with a nice speed vault twist, and while it looks great, I'm really starting to get burnt out on all of these hero landings and dramatic head dips. From here though, we get some references to the original show's earthbending origins. Yet despite the homage, this guy here just screams, I have no idea what I'm doing, while the guard on our right just throws a boxing jab. Iroh then cuts down the rocks by imbuing his shackles with fire, and then Zuko pops off with a scoot vanish tornado kick. Now, as cool as it all looks, it bothers me that they didn't reshoot this when Zuko's head and foot traveled out of the frame. The way it's framed now literally makes his ass and crotch the focus of the shot. Anyways, we wrap up the fight by having the Earthbender copy and paste the same Hungar pose we've seen several times already so he can summon a big ol' rock, only to have Iroh cast Incendio using one of his 4th level spell slots. But then the Earth guy decides to use his hat to block all of the flame, and it's this kind of stuff right here that makes people stop and question things. Don't get me wrong, when I watched this, I immediately got the reference to the original, but then I personally thought that this guy should be toast anyway because of just how big Iroh's blast is. Then it's made even worse when we cut to a shot of him a moment later, and there's no burns or anything on his uniform. I know it's a show, but everything feels so fake here. Nobody gets dirty from the rocks, nobody gets burned, and nobody gets wet. After this, Iroh gets shanked in the back with some pebbles, and Zuko wraps up with yet another tricking move, throwing a wonderfully executed and beautifully shot sideswipe to close out the sequence. And I just gotta say that I feel like an ass, because I genuinely believe this fight is the best in the adaptation so far, but it's still not what I would call great. I'd say it's serviceable, or good. I would also say the lack of real-world interaction with the literal elements of nature is more of a hindrance than a benefit to the show overall. It's wild, but I think these fights would actually be better without the context of being in this universe. Another good example of what I mean is in the Bumi and Aang duel that closes out the episode. While I do like Aang's windmill arms and butterfly kick, they've gotta stop using the wire work when he jumps because it never looks natural or flowy. And since I can't unsee it, I'ma make you all suffer too. Look at how Aang's clothes never billow when he uses airbending. Let me tell you, when you see it once, you'll always catch it. Beyond that though, there are some pretty nice homages to the original duel with Bumi's signature dropkick and the subtle footwork before earthbending. But even then, they drop the ball like with this slow-mo backflip here. It almost feels procedural at this point, like a turn-based RPG or something. We have Bumi attack, Aang evades or repels it, and then we have dialogue. Over and over and over again.
Please, Bumi, you don't have to do this.
You'd have known about that if you'd been around.
It's just stagnant and lifeless, and every time the scene starts to build up momentum, we've got to stop and talk about how Aang was gone and Bumi's butthurt about it. The one thing I can give them is that despite these actors not being familiar with martial arts, they are definitely using real movements here. Even these sloppy arm swings are from a real Dalu. But now, it's time for this fight and the episode itself to wrap up, and I've got to go ahead and get some of this stuff off of my chest, okay? At this point, there is enough differences between the original show and this version to give them grounds to say that they're an alternate interpretation of the source material, especially with characters like Bumi. But here's why I still think this is a weak choice. Aang may be the title character, but anybody who has watched the original can tell you it's really about Aang and Zuko. So much so that, in my opinion, this show could have easily been renamed The Fire Prince. The truth is, Aang's story is meant to be fun. He's just a kid after all, and for most of the show, it really feels like that, because you're kinda just along for the ride. Until he reaches his plot-relevant locations, that is, because ultimately, Aang's path is an adventure story. Yes, he has some dramatic beats, but as numerous other video essayists have pointed out, Aang doesn't really have to sacrifice much beyond what his actions did to lock him up for 100 years. And that's 1000% fine, because Zuko carries all of the really heavy emotional shit in his story. He's the one that has all of this nuanced political and personal stakes in what is going on in the active plot. If the overall main threat of the show ends up winning, Zuko still loses because he has very specific things he has to do before his side wins. Zuko's journey is the one that makes great live-action entertainment. Think about it. Even Shyamalan's adaptation had people giving Zuko and Iroh some love. And before I even started watching the Netflix version, all of my friends were telling me how Zuko and Iroh were fantastic. While I don't disagree that the actors in these roles were among the best of their respective projects, there's more to it than that. And it's because Zuko's story naturally lends itself better to a live-action protagonist, not Aang's. Because Aang's story is mainly about the whimsy and carefree adventure. If you take that out of Aang's journey and his character, like they did with this one and the Shyamalan version, then it becomes boring as fuck. Because that's the part of his plotline that made it interesting to begin with. And that's why the Netflix team made changes like this with Bumi. It was to give him and Aang more drama. But the problem is they kept the original setup. If you wanted to have Bumi feeling betrayed by Aang's disappearance, then maybe he should have been there when he ran away, because quite obviously, Aang didn't mean to get stuck in ice. He only took a flight to clear his head and calm down in this adaptation. This is why the original writers didn't do that with Bumi. Because it is quite obviously an accident, and this character was a literal mad genius, so he wanted to mess with an old homie while preparing him for the huge-ass challenge ahead, not blame him for running away. Now, call me crazy here, but if they wanted to really make a different interpretation, I think they should have flipped the roles. Have the main story be from Zuko's perspective, while Aang's journey is the side plot. The narrative would play out essentially the same, but you would save a lot of headaches and money from putting all of that whimsical shit in the B story, instead of trying to change the Aang character to fit in better with the live-action format.
But that is all I have for this episode, and I can't tell you how thankful I am that the show has been steadily improving with each new installment. And you know what? I'm gonna go ahead and say it. I'm pretty confident it's gonna continue to get better from here. Then again, I'm a glass half full kind of guy. Regardless, be sure to let me know what you think in the comments down below. Am I alone in thinking that Zuko's story would have been better as the main protagonist? Be sure to let me know, because I'm not exactly married to that idea. I just feel like his story carries most of the dramatic weight of the entire franchise. Either way, despite how busy my life has been, I can't wait to blast through the other 4 episodes remaining in this season. So if you enjoyed, feel free to like the video and make sure you subscribe if you want more martial arts and media breakdowns. But until next time, I'm bowing out. And I'll see you all in a new format.